Okay, so today we're going to talk about LGBT programs. First, we're going to do a little bit of a functional overview. The institutions that I spoke with were the LGBT Center at University of Louisville, the Office of LGBTQ plus Resources at the University of Kentucky, and the LGBTQ Programs and Services Office at Northern Kentucky University. A few things to take note of is that all of the names of these offices are different. That is a very common thing for LGBT offices and program offices at universities. They haven't been around for a super long time. They're kind of not a standard procedure. There are some best practices, but the naming is kind of under a transformation process all of the time. An example of that is that the University of Louisville's center used to be called the Office of LGBT Services. Then it got renamed to the LGBT Center, and now they're actually under a process of renaming again because LGBT doesn't actually capture everything that are the identities that they serve. Also taking note of the ages of the office, U of L has been around the longest. It was the first in Kentucky. It was founded in 2007. UK's office was 2015, although even though they're the youngest, they actually have sometimes the most services out of any of the offices. And then NKU's office was in 2013. And while that one has been around longer than UK's, it is the least well-funded, although it is still well-funded in the spectrum of things. Each of the offices have a different focus. Some of them, like the University of Kentucky especially, is heavily institutional focused. They still do student support programs, but they were founded to be more of an institutional office and serve policymaking and institutional interests, with, on the other side of that, being Northern Kentucky University, which was founded mostly to be student support and programming, although they do still influence policy just the same. So a look at the different institutional types. NKU is a master's institution, has just over 15,000 students, and it's mostly a non-residential campus. It's just outside of Cincinnati, so that makes sense. UK is a doctoral institution. It's got just under 30,000 students, and it's a mostly residential, rural campus. It's a very large campus. And then University of Louisville is also a doctoral institution. It's got just over 21,000 students, and it's mostly non-residential because, once again, it's in a city. These are the different unit missions. Most of the missions of the LGBT programs offices in Kentucky and in general in the country have very similar missions. Some of them focus more on programming, some of them focus more on resources and support, policy making, but in general, their purpose is to create a more inclusive environment and support students who are LGBT and otherwise. These are the different organizational structure charts. As you can see, U of L's LGBT Center has a very large structure. This is because they've been around the longest, and they have a satellite office in their health service campus. So that's why there's two different directors. And what's become an issue with them, from who I spoke with, is that sometimes it's difficult for them to prove that they need the support that they say they need, because they say, oh, you have all these, programs, you have all these people who work for you, you must be doing great, but then the institution doesn't necessarily always put money towards that. So right now, actually, they're struggling with their budget, and that's a difficult thing to maintain when you have such a large structure. UK is a pretty standard organizational structure. It kind of, they have not as many staff members as they would like, but they have enough for now, is what they said. NKU is slightly smaller. They did just recently get a coordinator to serve under the director, but for a long time, it was just the director. You can also tell that each of the top of these structures is a different person, and that's because LGBT programming offices are new. And so they kind of had to figure out where to put them. A lot of places put them under student affairs, like in KU, but a lot of, especially larger institutions, have either vice provost for diversity or vice president for diversity, and that's what you see at U of L. It can be a little confusing to figure out where these structures are located. And this is a budget overview. So UK didn't provide any budget numbers, but they said that their funding comes from various sources. LGBT centers and programming offices have had to be a little creative with where they get their money. Because especially in places like Kentucky, you're not always going to be in a political climate that is super friendly to having LGBT centers on campuses. But a lot of times universities want to have those things, so they have to find funding from places that aren't necessarily influenced by legislation or political influences. And so that's kind of what UK has done. They kind of pooled money from a bunch of different places, put it under this umbrella of diversity, and then from that comes the LGBT budget. NKU has a $15,000 operating budget. That's larger than some, but it is not very large considering that they still do some big programming. They just invited one of the Queer Eye cast members to speak at their institution, and that doesn't come cheap. So they do a lot with a little. And then U of L's LGBT programming office is a very interesting case because, as you can see from the budget here, they technically on paper didn't have a budget before this year. And that is because of what I said earlier about having to find ways to get the funding to the office. They were funded through a non-localized source of foundational funding before this year, but because of some changes in University of Louisville's policies, they had to be funded through the university budget this year. And most of that $170,000 is actually salary. The majority of their budget was cut because they actually have a very good fundraising track record. They have a couple events a year that raise tens of thousands of dollars. And the university saw that and basically said, well, you're doing a good job. We're going to cut your budget because you don't need us. Turns out some of those programs are actually going away this year. So they're struggling to figure out how to balance their budget with keeping up with what they were doing and all the programming that they were doing before. So this is kind of an overview of the different programs and services that they have available at these campuses. A lot of them are similar. LGBT program offices do a lot of work. They do student support stuff, they do policy making, they do education, and this is kind of an overview of all of those things. Some campuses focus more on the institutional, some focus more on the student, but in general, they have a lot of similar aspects, but each campus has what they call their signature programs. And so I talked to each administrator about what those signature programs are or what they would consider their most salient or special programs. Lisa Gunnerman, the director of the University of Louisville's office, basically pointed to what she called their bread and butter programs, which are their Pride Week celebration in the fall and their drag show in the spring. The drag show, I know especially, is a big fundraiser for them. Both these programs have been around for longer than the LGBT Center themselves, so they provide a very stable presence in the community, and that's why they kind of lean on them to be their kind of pillars when they're doing other programming. Dr. Lance Poston at UK said that he's had the benefit of kind of learning, especially from U of L, and what they've been doing and going from there, so taking a note out of that. He's done a lot of programming that mirrors what they're doing. But he also noted the LGBT History Month lecture, which they bring in a speaker every year to talk about some element of LGBTQ history, has been big for them. And also they have a social justice living learning community. It's called the Audre Lorde Social Justice Themed Living Learning Community that they're very proud of. U of L has a living learning community as well, but Dr. Poston listed it as one of their flagship programs. And then Bonnie Meyer at Northern Kentucky University said that their mentor program is something that they are very proud of, and then that they have really put a lot of work into. And their LGBT History Month programming, which is actually going on right now, is also something that they would consider their flagship, something that they do a lot of work for. So when it comes to collaboration, basically all of the directors said that they collaborate with anyone who is willing. Across campus, in the community, a lot of the work that LGBT programs offices do can't be done without collaboration because budgets are tight. And a lot of the partners that they have are kind of natural diversity partners, so multicultural centers and women's centers. But sometimes they do programs with people you wouldn't think of. Also, U of L and UK especially have been partnering with med school and students and the hospitals that they have to create more LGBT competent medical professionals, and that's been a really good collaboration for them. This is an example of some marketing that each of the institutions have done for their larger speakers that they've brought in over I think the past month in general for all of them. These speakers are not cheap, so they kind of have to collaborate with their offices to make it happen. You can see at U of L's list where it says thanks to our sponsors that there are a lot of names under there. Some unique concerns from each institution. U of L's LGBT Center basically cited their budget concerns because their budget was basically slashed entirely. UK said that one of their biggest concerns was cultivating buy-in from the community at large. Lexington is, while very LGBT friendly, can also be very LGBT unfriendly, so making sure that that buy-in is consistent. And also balancing institutional concerns with student concerns. They were founded as a more institutional support office, but they still have a very big function in supporting students, so balancing that. And NKU said for them it's budget concerns. They have a smaller budget. They don't have enough staff to do what they would like to do. And then also maintaining institutional buy-in because they have to kind of consistently convince the institution that they need to be there. They said that the president they have currently, who's newer, has kind of put their efforts into the forefront, and so they're not as worried about institutional buy-in as they used to be, but it's still a concern. For assessment and evaluation, all three of the institutions stated student engagement, campus climate, community engagement, and faculty and staff education as things that they assess, as things that they kind of use to gauge where they are in the work they're doing. And they do this by using surveys, interviews, social media metrics, post-event feedback, and then the Campus Pride Index, which is an online resource where it's a self-evaluation that universities do, and then they kind of get listed as how LGBT friendly they may or may not be. UK and U of L actually have been listed as the two of the top 25 institutions in the country for LGBT things. Some institutional strengths. UK said that their institutional strengths would be institutional support and policymaking, fundraising. They've gotten very good at fundraising in the past years, and also student support programming. They've leaned in to the student support programming a bit more than they had originally set out to do. NKU said that their strengths would be doing a lot with a little, community engagement, and student-focused programming. And then LGBT centers of U of L's strengths are innovation and growth. They're often the first to do a lot of things. Fundraising, they've been very successful fundraisers, sometimes to a fault. And then campus presence. They have a very big campus presence and are very vocal and noticeable on campus. And then some weaknesses for UK would be addressing intersections of race and sexuality and gender identity. UK is a very white institution, and so, but that doesn't mean that there aren't people who have intersecting identities, and so they've been kind of figuring out how to balance that. The amount of work on staff members, LGBT programs offices do a lot for a lot of people, and even with a decent amount of staff members, it's typically not enough. and then balancing institutional needs and student